Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay or Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
In the middle 1960s, if you say, I want to fly, you fly. I don't know if you had a paper route or what. Richard Levy is a legend, folks. Multi-decades with American Airlines. I won't bore you with a resume other than to say he soloed on his 16th birthday. What was that like, Captain Levy? What was it like to be 16 years old and there's nobody helping you?
Well, let's say I was ready at 14, but Federal Aviation regulations said I have to wait till my 16th birthday. So my instructor and I trained and trained and trained. I was ready a lot earlier, but we waited to the 16th birthday to comply with federal regulations. And then the newspaper was there in Houston. They covered me. It was very flattering, but it was fun to fly by myself.
You encapsulate the romance of aviation in America. It is shattered this morning. Not that you see this coming, but all of the talk, as was alluded to, Captain Levy, in the press conference, the near misses, our interior confidence in LAX or DFW or the others. Is it shattered this morning, our confidence in aviation?
No, I don't think so. Is this sad and regretful? Of course it is. For the families of the deceased on both sides. The PSA regional airplane, by the way, this was a PSA regional aircraft operated on behalf of American Airlines, but the flight crew were not part of the American Airlines pilots itself. Zero training from American Airlines. Yes, it had an American Airlines flight number. Every major airline in the U.S., not every, but majority have regional airlines feeding them in the smaller cities around the United States. That works very successfully. In any event, this mid-air collision here between the PSA aircraft, the CRJ-700 and the Army Black Hawk helicopter is very regretful, and we're going to learn from it. And I have some information to talk to you about that. But it is, as you know, very, very early. But some evidence is already starting to show up right now.
Captain Levy, how do you view the U.S. commercial airspace these days in terms of air traffic controllers, technology deployed? Is this airspace overcrowded? Is it well kind of managed, do you believe?
Very well managed, extremely well managed. I've flown the world, not every single airport, of course, but the majority of the major ones in Europe, Russia, China, of course, all over the United States and Asia. And the airports in the United States, whether it's JFK, whether it's DFW, you mentioned Chicago O'Hare, I was based there 35 years. Magnificently managed and run, but it's a two-way process there. You have the air traffic controllers on the radar as you approach or depart the airport, and then what we call the local controllers, the control tower people, and they're often working with good weather like it was last night at just before 9 p.m. Eastern time. It's a see and be seen. And so we can talk about that, but the PSA was brought into the airport normally, safely, correctly. We're going to be focusing on this Army helicopter, which we can talk about.
One of the changes here is, for example, Reagan going from 15 million passengers to 25 million passengers. In London, the talk of a congested one-runway Gatwick. I hear that Munich is terribly congested. I'm sure, Captain Richard Levy, you know many other airports just as congested. Are we pushing, in terms of not in my backyard, not building airports, are we pushing the envelope on crowded in modern commercial aviation?
In my opinion, not a bit. By the way, speaking of Munich, I made the first landing at the new Munich airport in the 90s from the United States. Great airport over there, great air traffic controllers, and all over Germany. But back to the U.S. to answer your question, we're not pressing the envelope, as we say in aviation. whatsoever, because as every one of us know, if we're approaching an airport and there's a big event, a football event, a baseball event, a rock star is there, there's going to be a lot of extra traffic. So what they do is one of two things: either we go into a holding pattern, or to be more energy efficient, they hold you. There's a ground stop. You don't take off to go to the destination. Say weather has gone through Chicago. I told you I lived up there. A big snowstorm has covered the airport, is cleared out. The runways are clear. They're going to space the airplanes 10 to 20 miles apart. But back to last night, we had the PSA CRJ 700 on an approach to runway 01, and then they were asked, could they swing over, could they alter their approach and make a visual approach to runway 33. Nothing unsafe about that. Has nothing to do with traffic congestion whatsoever.
Captain Levy, when a military aircraft is in commercial space, it's the commercial air traffic controllers that have authority, right? That's not a military. I mean, they're treated like any other aircraft in the space, correct?
Correct.
So there you go. I mean, so there's going to be some issues there, Tom. I think.
One final question, Captain Levy, and you know, I remember the day when Ronald Reagan, I'm going to say this is an amateur, sir, broke the Union of Air Traffic Controllers. A lot of the reporting, including Sidney Ember in the Times, they have a grid out of the new workload of air traffic controllers. 10 years ago, I mean, you're a more ancient. Levy was a Kitty Hawk.
Yes.
Richard Levy, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, did you have more confidence that the air traffic controllers weren't fatigued?
No, I had no qualm or concern about the air traffic controllers. Yes, that was also my vintage in 1981. My neighbor in Chicago in the suburbs was an Air Force controller. I remember him, and he was brought from the Air Force to Chicago O'Hare, sharpest guy on the planet, and I had no qualm or concern. They did have extra spacing for between aircraft back then.
One final question, Captain. Can you bring back the 747?
I'd love to bring it back. May I comment? You all mentioned one comment, and then I'll let you go.
Please.
Technology. That's going to be an issue in this accident. That again, the PSA was asked, could you turn right and fly at what we call a visual approach, very safe, to runway 33? They said yes. For that size of airplane, not a problem at all. Then you have the Army Black Hawk helicopter, which is on a training mission going to the Potomac River. Training mission does not mean they're amateurs whatsoever. There are pros, they're good as they come. You have an instructor pilot, most likely, I'm an Air Force type guy. And then you have somebody who is upgrading to whatever they call an Army aircraft commander, perhaps. In any event, so the PSA is descending. And we have equipment on the aircraft, on all commercial aircraft operating Part 121 of the Federal Aviation Regulations called TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System. And it's an audio that says traffic, and as you get closer, it says climb, or descend. Well, why wouldn't that be going off? Because you're so close to the ground. So that is, it's blanking out as you get close to the ground.
We've talked to Robert Crandall over the years here at Bloomberg Surveillance, sir, and it's a great honor to speak to you today. Captain Richard Levy, 40 years with American Airlines.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
At 2 a.m., 3 a.m., we were piecing together the show, and it was a group resounding call of Team Surveillance. Can we get George Ferguson on? It's not just his knowledge of aviation, and we had Captain Richard Levy on, who's a pilot and incredibly experienced. George Ferguson is the one that pieces the industry together for us. George, where is the aviation industry in America in a year, in 2 years after this tragedy?
I mean, I think that the aviation industry has been, has been much safer than it had been in the past, right? And so I think that safety record continues. I mean, we're all saddened to see the event that just happened, the crash. Unfortunately, from time to time they happen, but it's much safer than it was decades ago. Right now, I think we're going through a phase in aviation, as we're going through in other industries, where there's a generational turnover in the labor in the business, and so there has to be a bunch of training. And I think, that training is critical to maintain safety. I'm worried that there may be, maybe the Black Hawk pilot was in the midst of a training flight around a very busy airport and didn't, pay attention to all the cues from ATC. But again, I think the future of aviation is all about training, strong training, and building in that safety culture. And I think we've got to pay very high attention to it right now, given this generational change. But I think it continues to get better from here.
George, Paul and I were talking about this. I mean, there's a lot of reporting of near misses, beautiful graphics and fancy analysis because we've got all the technology. Are there more near misses now, or in the old days did we just miss the near misses?
I've seen more reporting of near misses and other kinds of operations where airplanes are landing on taxiways and things like that. And again, I'm going to attribute it to there's a new generation coming in as we retire a bunch of baby boomers, people with less experience. There's been a lot of turnover in pilot ranks. ATC, we know they've been recruiting heavily because their ranks have been depleted. And so it's just critical here that we get this next generation trained up and focused on the right safety procedures. But I think there is more. Right now.
Hey, George, just give us a sense, from your conversations with the airlines that you cover, where is this country, where's our air system in terms of air traffic controllers? Where are we in terms of where we need to be? Do we have enough ATC folks out there, or where are we?
No, we know we have shortages, right? We know there's been challenges recruiting people into that business. I still hear the airlines talk about ATC issues limiting their operations. So we know we don't have enough, and we know we need to recruit people into the industry. I think one of the challenges the industry has too, maybe it's lost some of its appeal over the years. People, young kids like tech a little bit more. So we got to go out and find more folks that love aviation and pull them into the industry, maybe work a little harder to get folk to recruit people into the industry, because maybe it isn't as exciting as it used to be, but that's a challenge.
And how do the commercial airliners, how do they typically feel about operating in areas where there's military aircraft? As we just saw today, I'm guessing that it just increases, just some of the tensions of operating.
It does, right? So, Reagan right downtown there in D.C., the convenience of that airport is huge. As anybody knows, it's flown into that. But, it's the nation's capital, so you're always going to have a fair amount of military activity around there, just trying to protect the nation's capital. And so, to have Blackhawks flying around the approach end of an airport, though, is extremely risky. I wonder if people don't revisit that. And to have a training flight around the approach end of Reagan at a busy time, busy evening is really difficult, right? So probably something we need to think about.
George, the critics here, and I'm not one of them, I don't think Paul is, I don't think we're qualified to be critics, will sometimes take our air traffic controller fatigue and staffing back to 1981, when President Reagan went after, I'm going to generally say the union. It was 13,000 people at the time. Do you buy it?
No, it's been a lot of years since then, so I think we've probably fully recovered since Reagan let go all the controllers.
Where do we typically get controllers? Where do they recruit them from? And why is this so difficult? Starbucks, yeah. Why is it so difficult? It seems like, I don't know, the pay is there. It's kind of exciting. I know it's stressful. But where do they typically get recruits?
So, I guess people who love aviation and don't want to be a pilot, maybe want to sleep in their own bed every night, become a controller. But you can imagine it's a really difficult job, right? You've got a lot of lives on your hands. If you're controlling at an airport like Reagan, Newark, LaGuardia, there's a lot of things going on. So you better be top of your game. Yeah. Look, during the pandemic, remember we were all sort of, those of us in business in the office world, we were. We weren't even going to the offices anymore, right? We were waking up at 6:30, turning our computer on at 7. You don't get that in the air traffic control business. You get a chance to do some late night shifts, and you're tired, and you're trying to bring airplanes in for a landing and keep everybody separated. I think it's a challenging job, right? And that's one of the reasons why it may not appeal to everybody.
George, you're expert on this. I guess DFW is the size of Luxembourg, and you mentioned, Paul, earlier, Denver. We went from Stapleton out to the beautiful airport in Denver. Salt Lake City building a palace, Kansas City building a palace. Do we need more airports? Do we need more gates, George Ferguson?
Well, look, I'm going to say that the challenge is that, some of those key airports in the country you can't replace well, right? LaGuardia, Reagan, because of their downtown proximity, even if you have more airports, there's capacity at Dulles to put airplanes into, but nobody wants to take the trip in from Dulles to DC. So I don't think this is we don't have enough airport, issue. Again, I think it's a Black Hawk training flight around an extremely busy airport. ATC, it sounds like they moved the landing
flight
runway
to 33, the shorter runway, up to the north, closer to the White House.
And so if you're that Black Hawk pilot and you weren't paying attention, and ATC said, "Hey, Black Hawk, you got this CRJ," you miss on that, and you weren't expecting that airplane to come into that other runway, bad things happen. So I don't think this is an airport issue. I think this is training, paying attention. The Black Hawk apparently just didn't see what was going on.
George, thank you. We look for your publication at Bloomberg Intelligence as well. Just great conversations today on this tragedy there with a guy with decades of experience in aviation.
Yep. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, "Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The right person at the right time. Francis Donald, RBC Capital Markets, joins our chief economist. Francis, I saw buoyant consumption, which tells me there's something that gave way. What was the weak statistic in the GDP algebra?
Oh, well, excuse me, we got a little decline in business investment. We got a little bit of a stagnation in trade activity, but nothing is a narrative change for the United States. And that's what I'm looking for when I look at data that comes through. Is there's anything that's giving us a yellow flag? And right now, no real yellow flags. The consumer on aggregate, emphasis on aggregate, is very strong. And I was told very early in my career 20 years ago, never bet against the U.S. consumer. That advice is still true.
Okay, I get it. Yesterday, the Fed level, but Canada cut rates. ECB cuts rates of some flavor as well. Is the gap widening between America's prosperity and other nations struggling?
It's a very wide gap. One of the best ways that you can think about that is all these central bankers are talking about their neutral rate. What is the rate that is neither tightening nor easing on the economy? And nobody else, except for the U.S. Federal Reserve, is claiming that their neutral rate is much higher than it was before COVID. Canada, ECB, all effectively saying their neutral rate is probably around 2.5%. And now we have a Fed that says we think that rates are above the neutral rate, but 4% seems okay to us. That is a huge change in the way that global monetary policy operated. And I think it's being driven by massive amounts of U.S. fiscal spending that's put a complete floor under growth and is creating this offset between fiscal and monetary. So as much as there was focus on the Fed yesterday, and we always have to write our Fed write-ups, I spent more time thinking about government funding freezes and what the path of fiscal is going to look like ahead. Because my sense is it's the fiscal path ahead that's going to be more important for the Fed than maybe even the unemployment rate or the CPI.
Francis, as the chief economist for the Royal Bank of Canada, I am sure you and your colleagues have thought long and hard about tariffs and what they may mean for the economy in North America, particularly Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. How are you thinking about those? Because guess what? February 1st is 2 days away.
It is. And one of the challenges is that just about everybody wants us to give a nice round number. What does this tariff policy mean for GDP or growth? But it's an extraordinarily difficult economic exercise. We still engage in it, but it's really hard. And we've actually developed infographics to try to explain just how convoluted this is. Even before a tariff lands on an economy, you tend to see things like uncertainty shocks weigh on business investment, inventory hoarding. So we were even noticing in the GDP data this morning that consumers had this big spend increase on durable goods in the United States. And we were talking amongst ourselves, is that consumers that are maybe thinking about autos and washing machines starting to become more expensive? So even before the tariff lands, you tend to see inventory hoarding that changes your data. You got to talk about whether there's going to be retaliation. You got to talk about what secondary industries are being impacted. And then maybe some of the biggest assumptions you have to make, and this is what keeps me up at night, how are central bankers going to respond? Because while we have a good playbook, Tom, we've been talking for years, we know if inflation goes up, central banks hike.
Right.
But what if inflation going up is a function of tariffs rising and interest rates are not going to impact that type of inflation? That's the biggest question that we have.
Okay, this is really important. And Carl Weinberg and Mary Chen just publishing High Frequency Economics with the idea that it was, within the mix and the soup of it, a disappointing report. Was there a tariff reaction in that second look at GDP, or does that await? Let me do the math. April 30th or, May 1st report?
My sense is we'll see more of that, but what I'm really looking for is the inventories component. Now, this is not something that seems very dramatic most of the time, but if we do see a lot of Americans who start thinking about, hey, prices could go up, you could actually see growth accelerate on the surface because you're going to see an acceleration in trade moving forward. So we did see that. We know a little bit more about tariffs now than we did in 2018, and inventory hoarding is a real economic development that could occur within a tariff landscape. And let me just say this, it doesn't even matter if the tariff itself is implemented. We see this behavior ahead of the tariff coming through. So even all this talk, all the tweets, et cetera, of tariffs will have an economic impact. We know that to be the case.
Francis, I think we here in America, we import some stuff from Canada, from Mexico. What's the feeling up there in Canada today about what kind of, response the Canadian government may have if the tariffs are in fact placed?
Well, I'll share with you that in Canada, our Canadian clients view tariffs as a high probability, high impact event, and they are very likely, if they're applied in extreme, to create a recession in Canada, and different variations, of course, would not produce it. We're still waiting on those details. In the US, my clients are a little less concerned about either the probability or the impact that comes through. But just a reminder, Americans import a ton of stuff from Canada, significant amounts of electricity, a quarter of all the oil consumed comes from Canada, everything from nickel, 40% of the nickel in the US economy. There's a significant amount of imports that come through from Canada that will raise prices for Americans, and how the currency responds is going to be a big impact from that. But most government officials in Canada, this is just public knowledge, it's not me opining, have talked about retaliation. So we know the balance of risks. We might not know the magnitude for Americans, but we know the balance of risks is going to be higher prices and lower growth. And just the details of that is going to matter extraordinarily. And it's not me trying to say we haven't done the work, we have, but there are so many steps to modeling a tariff impact that it can't be summarized in one specific word, which is why the Federal Reserve is not implementing it. And it's why places like the Bank of Canada are speaking to the risks, but not putting a dollar figure on it just yet.
Francis, David Gura just spoke with Chrystia Freeland. As you know, there's a derby up in Canada for the next leader after Mr. Trudeau. I know it's inappropriate for you to pick sides on this, but help our American audience. What's the timeline to the election right now into the spring?
Oh, we don't know. We know there'll be a new leader of the liberal policy. And I am an economist, not a political scientist. But from what I read in the papers, that means that the new leader of that policy will become prime minister and then likely an election will be called. So if you think about uncertainty for the Canadian economy or even uncertainty for American businesses that are trying to figure out will there be retaliatory measures, it's been really challenging to hear one particular cohesive voice because at this time we're really relying on provincial leaders, for example, to give us a sense of what's ahead. Now, Tom, you've got me totally outside the scope of my credentials here. What I can tell you is people are talking a lot about the uncertainty of tariffs, but uncertainty shocks are powerful economic taxes. And whether you're in Canada or the US right now, you're experiencing different variations of uncertainty taxes. So some of our data, which is backward looking, is not going to show it, but you should expect this to show up in places like business surveys, manufacturing activity, consumer sentiment to a certain perspective. I really would not downplay how important an uncertainty tax or uncertainty shock can be on an economy and all the places and the tentacles for which that'll flow through all of North America.
This has been wonderful. Thank you for the brief. Francis Donald with the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.
Joining us now is John Stoltzfus of OPCO of Oppenheimer. We're thrilled that he could attend with a very optimistic call on America. John Farrell put out a tweet yesterday that showed X% of stocks flat to even lower, while a few stocks go up and away, like Facebook, Meta yesterday as well. Do you see any broadening out in the great Stoltzfus bull market?
You know, Tom, first of all, our hearts are with those in the accident today in DCA. And then, but related to the markets, we see a broadening of the rally that had started up until we got this deep seek question, and then we saw a pullback. I mean, right now I think the S&P is still down about 1% from its January 23rd peak. The Nasdaq's down about 2%. But when you look at it, the trend is upward in the sense that we've got the Fed's doing the right thing, we believe. We're one of the few strategists who think that. Business and the consumers and job growth, resilient.
In the Fed meeting yesterday, I thought the most interesting debate was simply on real and top-line economic growth. Jan Hatzius and Goldman Sachs yesterday came out and shaved, I believe, Q4 under 2%. That's a bold call. I don't want to talk to John Stoltzfus, stock guy. I want to talk to John Stoltzfus, economist. Do you believe in a solid, resilient American economy forward?
I think the way I'd put it, it's a remarkably resilient, and I think that's been the case that has caused skeptics and bears a lot of agita over the course of since the rally began in the fall of 22. I think it was in October of 2022. After a really rough year, the rally began, and it persisted through 23 and 24. We think it carries through here. We've got that 7,100 target that was looking for about 17% upside from the point where we put it in December. It's reached closer to around an 18-20% kind of upside. But we think it's very possible. The years leading up to the tech bubble were about 4 or 5 years, as I recall, with remarkable performance from the S&P 500 as technology became a more important part of everyday life for both business and the consumer. And that's where we are, but it's about sharper virtual picks and shovels for both business and the consumer to deal with each other and deal with the data that is produced on a daily basis, which has grown exponentially in the last decade.
John, we heard from the Fed yesterday. I think the market's discounting maybe 1 or 2 rate cuts, so there's not a lot the Fed's going to do for us in 2025. It feels like earnings are going to have to be the driver for this market. How confident are you in the earnings for corporate America?
Well, so far, this fourth quarter earnings season looks pretty good. Last I looked on the EA page on my Bloomberg, it was 8 sectors positive earnings growth. 4 of those were double-digit earnings growth. Half were tech-related. The others were, as I recall, it was financials. And for the life of me at this moment, the last one I don't recall what it was. But the thing is, it's a mix of cyclicals and growth that are driving this, and we think it's it's not the trees grow to the sky. It's just that a market can climb a remarkable wall of worry in terms of dealing with all kinds of things.
I found fascinating yesterday, and my small brain can't remember who I was talking to. Lisa, has it been a blur the last 48 hours? It's been a blur the last 48 hours, particularly with this horrific crash. Somebody mentioned to me incremental 401k purchases. Mike Green, Simplified Asset Management. This goes back to my essay of the year 3 years ago, Lawrence McDonald, who walked through the wall of money that's just out there, relentlessly putting a systematic bid to the market. Do you buy that story?
We do, and we think it's not exuberance, but rather has to do with a fundamental thinking that I think has occurred in the private client group, which is that Social Security will simply not provide the same percentage of retirement income that it provided for boomers' parents and their grandparents.
So we're Savings America.
Oh, it's.
I think this is under discussed,
and it's one that frequently, whenever you get a boost in the 10-year yield, the bond crowd says, bonds are competitive with stocks, but on an intermediate to longer term basis, history tells us, past performance no guarantee of future results, that stocks indeed where to be.
Good morning, everyone. It is Bloomberg Surveillance from New York City this morning. Good morning to 92.9 FM in Boston, Bloomberg 1130 in New York, and a sleepless 99.1 in Washington. A horrific plane crash at Reagan National Airport overnight. I'm sure many of you are up to speed on this. We'll continue with more information on it. In scheduled 12 minutes, the mayor of Washington will provide a press conference with various officials, responders, if you will, and we will, of course, bring you that coverage worldwide. Our goal here, folks, is to brief you on the crash, provide background of the aviation industry. We're working on guests on that, former pilots, engineers, former federal officials to speak to us about it. But we're thrilled to bring in here people like John Stoltzfus. Paul?
John, what are some of the sectors here that you're looking for in 2025? Again, we had, as you mentioned, 2 really strong years in the S&P 500 performance in 23 and 24. As you looked at 25, are you looking for certain sectors to lead this market, or how are you thinking about it?
Well, we're looking at it from a perspective of, first of all, of sectors, and we think it continues to be information technology and communication services. And communication services has the old phone companies, but it's also got the streamers, the search engines, and it's got social media, and it's a big stuff for the AI story. But we're also looking at industrial sector, which is heavily embedded with technology, and financials and consumer discretionary.
You like the banks?
Well, we still like the big banks, and we think as interest rates are normalized, it's good for them.
It's not a day to say this, but John, you're killing it. Your call on the bull market has just been absolutely superb.
I'm very flattered.
John Stoltzfus, do I need a new Gretsch guitar?
I tell you, a penguin or
I think a penguin.
A penguin might be an extraordinary.
Thank you, Mrs. Keene. Good morning, Mr. Stoltzfus says I need a Gretsch penguin. You're dismissed, John Stoltzfus. Thank you so much for Dow S&P, I should say 7,000 as well.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.